Hello and welcome to this webinar on how to get physical products to market. Now, today we're going to be covering a lot of different topics, and we're going to be covering them all from the point of view of a small/medium-sized business or a solopreneur. So if you're somebody who's looking to sell your products on Amazon through FBA or through a Shopify store or a WooCommerce store, then this is a perfect place to start for you. Now, if you're a huge company already with a lot of revenue, then the steps and advice would probably look a little bit different. So this webinar is primarily geared towards those who are just starting out. So with that, let's continue and see what we will cover today. As you see on this slide, we will go through idea creation, so how to come up with an idea for a product. We will go through how to protect that idea through patents and other things as well. We will look at how to test demand affordably, so how do you know that this product idea is worth putting your time and money into without spending a fortune up front. Then after that, we will go through some fundamentals around manufacturing so that you have a grasp of how the different manufacturing methods look, so that you have that in mind when you create your product ideas. And then finally, we will talk about sourcing in China, and then talk about the most common mistakes that I have seen businesses make as they take their product ideas to market. Now, before we jump into all of those things, let me just mention a few quick words about myself and why I'm even qualified to give this webinar to begin with. So, my name is Tony Larsson, and I am originally from Stockholm in Sweden. That's where I grew up, and that's where I started off as a little kid, tinkering and disassembling products, trying to reassemble those products, and basically always being fascinated by technology. But then my professional career as an industrial design engineer kicked off when I decided to take a bachelor in product design and then a master's in industrial design engineering. And from there, I just went on and worked with what I studied for. So I started working for a company as an industrial design engineer. And then quite quickly, I moved to working as a freelancer, which allowed me to work with a huge quantity of projects and also a lot of different types of products. And then for the last years now, I've been running my own design agency where I work with a small team of people to help small and medium-sized companies get their products to market. And again, same with the freelancing. I have seen throughout these years of running the agency a huge number of projects, and also that is kind of what motivated me to create this webinar to begin with, because I've started to see some patterns in what works and what does not work when it comes to physical product development. So I want to create this webinar so that I can highlight these patterns so that you don't have to repeat the mistakes that others have done before you. And with that, let's jump into the first topic and start talking about how to create your first product idea. Now, when it comes to idea creation, I have to say up front that I personally believe that a lot of what is known as innovation management, a lot of what is written on that topic is frankly false and oftentimes misleading, because what they do is they write the history after the innovation has happened. So they backtrack and try to fit the innovation into their own narrative and say, oh, well, it happened because they had this type of brainstorming session, or it happened because they had this type of organizational structure. And in my opinion, this is simply not how innovation really works. So in this webinar, I will try to keep it really brief and only talk about what I actually do know works. So with that, let's start. I believe that innovation can fundamentally be broken down into two categories. The first one, that is incremental innovation, where we improve a little bit on something that already exists. So it's a marked improvement, but it's not completely revolutionizing for the product per se. The second type of innovation, that is a step type innovation, so the blue line that we have marked in the graph here on the right. And this is where we completely either create a new category for products, or we just improve a product so much that it's almost nothing like what it was before. And some examples of this would be the first iPhone coming out. We can see the phones, how they looked before the iPhone and after the iPhone, and it's completely different. And the same thing would be said for the car and how that revolutionized transport, and I'm sure that you can think of some additional examples to that yourself. And the reason for why I'm dividing innovation into these two categories is that I believe that the first type, incremental innovation, that is something that we can try to systematize, at least to a certain extent. So we can think about how to make that happen in a methodical fashion. The second type, the step type innovation, that is something where I don't believe there is a formula for that, because it requires that the right idea comes at the right time for the right person. And if you are going for that type of innovation, that's great. I would just say that then be prepared to most likely fail, and also be prepared to spend a lot of capital, because I believe that those types of innovations nowadays especially require a lot of upfront investment to get going. So because of those reasons, we in this webinar will focus on the first type of innovation and talk about incremental innovations. Now, as you start thinking about what product you want to create, I think the first question that you should ask yourself is, what problem is my product addressing? What issue is it relieving? And then the second question you should ask yourself is, are people paying money to solve this particular problem? So, because you are aiming at an incremental improvement, there should already be other solutions on the market where people are spending their money, which is a great sign of validation for your idea actually being a good business move. So, let's imagine that I want to develop a new design for anti-slip shoes for elderly people. Alright. Then before going full steam ahead and developing this product, I should use a tool like Jungle Scout, for example, where I can enter into Amazon and see what different products are generating revenue. And then I can look for similar products and see how much money are these sellers making. And if it is too low, then this is a really big red flag, because that means that perhaps this is not a big enough issue for people to spend money on. So then if there is really no signal there, if there is no serious money being spent on this problem, then I should probably look elsewhere. Now, one question that I always ask myself for any design project is, what is true for this particular product? So what are the features that are really not up for changing? And this question, it is a very helpful way for overcoming what is known as the blank page syndrome. So the fear of starting to putting an idea down when you have no constraints whatsoever and you just have this blank, perfect, pristine piece of paper in front of you. So for example, let's say I'm designing a pair of over-the-ear headphones. Alright, so what is true for that product? Well, it's true that that product goes onto the head of a human. Alright, the human has 2 ears, and those 2 ears are the only way to get audio into the brain, which means that there should be 1 ear cup per ear, because there would be no reason to have anything more. Alright, then we already know that there should be 2 ear cups, and then we can also look into the specifics of the drivers that the headphones could be using, look what range of audio signals those drivers cover, and then determine what number of drivers each of those ear cups should have, and then like that, little by little, we create a specification sheet for our product of things that really cannot change. And this might sound even a little bit silly when I'm talking about headphones and how it should have 2 ear cups, because of course that's the case. But this is really a great way to, first off, overcome the blank page syndrome like I talked about. But second, also to not take anything for granted, because when you do this type of exercise of really going to the most fundamental aspects of your product and then working up from there, then you make sure that you are not missing any opportunities for real innovation. So this is what is known as first principle thinking, and it's a great way to start building your product idea. Now, moving on to the next slide here. Exploratory sketching. This is a phrase that I would like to coin, because I feel like that sketching is usually too associated with sketching for presentation. So oftentimes we feel that a sketch that we do needs to be beautiful enough, needs to be precise enough so that other people will directly understand the intention of the sketch. But in my personal experience, the most value I'm getting out of sketching actually comes during idea creation, because sitting and doing exploratory sketching, which can also be called doodling, it's actually a great way to overcome your inhibitions and start generating ideas. Now, to round this idea creation chapter off, let's for a moment look at different manufacturing methods and look at those which have the lowest startup cost. So, which manufacturing methods can we use without spending a huge amount up front before having validated our idea? And there are several of these manufacturing methods which have low startup cost. 3 of which I would like to focus especially on are laser cutting, where we take a sheet of either metal or plastic, and then we cut it with a laser, or also we can cut it with a water jet. And this has almost zero startup cost because there is no tooling required for this. We have then CNC milling, where we take a block of a material, usually aluminium, and then we remove the material that we do not want so that we are left with the part desired. And again, this is something with quite low startup cost. And then finally, also I want to mention sheet metal, which is where we take laser cut sheets and then we bend them like origami into the products that we want. And then there are several other manufacturing methods with low startup cost. However, I won't be talking about those here because we only have so much time to do this. But in summary, basically anything that requires a mold to be produced will have a higher upfront cost. And also, if you actually do need to create a mold and invest into either injection molding or maybe casting, then do remember that the cost for the mold does go up cubically to the side of the mold. So increasing the size of the mold just a little bit lengthwise might have a huge impact on the cost overall. So do keep that in mind if you do feel you need to invest into injection molding or some other casting based technique. And these manufacturing methods are obviously a little bit difficult to keep in mind during idea generation if you are not a trained engineer or if you have not already worked with different types of manufacturing in the past. And for that reason, my last advice on idea generation is actually to go out and consider hiring an industrial designer, which can help you come up with good concepts for your product. And while this might seem like a cost up front, it could actually be a way to save you money by just going to ideas that are more likely to work right from the start. Because an industrial designer, a good one, will have an engineering degree as well, so they will know what can actually be manufactured and what cannot be manufactured. And this brings us nicely to our next topic here, which is patents and protecting your idea. Because if you're going to be working with an external contractor, you do need some kind of legal protection, right? So that the idea is still patentable and so that the designer does not go off and post the product in his or her portfolio without your permission, for example. Now, before we delve into discussing the different patent types that do exist, I need to say upfront that if you're going to be discussing your idea, you better have an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement prepared, so that your idea is still patentable and so that it does not become public knowledge. And the way an NDA looks, it will vary depending on which country you reside in, but you will need some kind of document there so that your idea is safe. Moving on, there are 2 fundamental patent types, and those are design patents and utility patents. And these 2 types exist in most countries. Now, the first type of patent, the design patent, it is, as the name implies, something that protects the design, the aesthetics of a product. And for example, this lamp could maybe be patented for its spiral structure and the way that the spiraling parts go together at the bottom here. A utility patent, on the other hand, it protects the functionality of a product and maybe a certain mechanism of a product. And these are more difficult to get than a design patent. However, it usually also provides more protection for your idea because it is more difficult to work around. Now, part of this presentation is about how to validate our idea without spending enormous amounts of money before we even start. And because of that, I'm gonna mention right now one way in which you can validate your idea without investing the thousands and thousands needed for a real utility patent or a design patent. And that is something called a PPA, a provisional patent application. Now, a provisional patent application, it does not provide any protection per se, but it does give you priority when you do apply for the final patent. So the way this works is that, say that I have an idea for, again, let's take the anti-slip shoe example. So I have an idea for a shoe that is better in some way and provides better grip during the winter. Okay. I'm not ready to invest yet into a full patent because I'm not sure that people will actually pay money for this. So what I'm gonna do, instead of getting a utility patent right away, I'm gonna post a provisional patent application for an innovation related to these anti-slip shoes. And this provisional patent application does not need as much information as a full utility patent, but it gives me up to 1 year in most countries to file my final patent application. So let's say that I file this provisional patent application, and during this year somebody else files a utility patent for a similar type of anti-slip protection that I was envisioning. Well, if my provisional patent application was filed before the other party filed their utility patent, then I have the priority. So I can actually file my full utility patent after them, and then my patent will be valid and theirs will not. So I have the priority on this. And the nice thing about a PPA is that they are way cheaper than a full patent application, and they give enough time, as I said, usually 1 year, to test out the idea and the market demand before investing into a full patent. So with this anti-slip shoe, I will have a whole year to see if I can make it into a profitable product before I invest the thousands needed to protect the idea. So to summarize the whole patent discussion again, we have the design patents for the aesthetics, we have the utility patents for the functionality of a product, which are more enforceable than design patents, and then we have provisional patents applications, which do not provide protection, but they do provide priority when going to actually file your final patent. Now let's talk about idea validation, because as I mentioned previously, we do want to validate our idea and the market demand before investing a huge amount of money or a lot of time up front. And to do this, we need to test quickly, we need to test affordably, and we need to get a reliable result on our tests. And now I will provide a method for doing exactly that. So what I'm going to suggest is that you test your product idea with rendered images of your design. And in my opinion, this is the minimal viable test, or whatever you can call it, to testing if people actually want to pay money for your product. Because anything less than a rendered image will actually not provide the customer with enough information to give you a response on whether they would or would not buy your product. And anything more than a rendered image starts to hit quite high costs, and for that reason I would advise to avoid it. And here are a couple of rendered images examples that we created for the design agency. And as you can see, even though it is not perfectly photorealistic, it is definitely enough to give the customer an idea of what the product is, and to give them a chance to answer the question of whether or not they would put down money for this product. Okay, so moving on to the next part. Let's imagine that you have now worked with a freelancer to create some awesome designs and rendered images of your product, and now you want to use these images to test demand. How do we do it? Well, there's a couple of different tools that we can use to do this. And the first one that I would like to mention is something called PickFu, and many Amazon sellers use this already. With PickFu, you can basically create an A/B test where you get a lot of feedback from customers, and the customers actually write which design they liked the best and why they liked or disliked a certain design. The other thing you can do is to create a Shopify or a WooCommerce landing page which showcases your product renderings, and then try to get people to pre-order your product so that their credit cards are charged once you release the product. And as far as validation goes, this is really the strongest validation that you can get, where somebody actually puts down money for what you are offering. Then if you do go with the Shopify or the WooCommerce landing page route, then we do need some kind of way to get people to those pages. And one way that you can use, again using your rendered images, is to set up an A/B test on Facebook ads. And that way you are not only asking people to pre-order your product, but you can also see which of the rendered images work the best. Because remember, Amazon and most other online shopping right now, it is a little bit like Tinder, where the first picture really matters. So for example, if one of the images in the Facebook ads campaign is outperforming the other one by a huge margin, then maybe that's all of the information that you need, because that means that the product is not grabbing the customer's attention as much as you would like, and you will have to spend more money on marketing and lowering your profit margins in the process. Now moving on to the topic of development. And here it is very dependent on which type of product that you are creating, and also it's such a huge topic that we won't really be able to delve into any depths in this webinar just because of the time constraint. But I will share some tips with you that I think are generalizable across many different product types. The first tip that I would like to give is to work with engineers and not pure designers. And the reason for this is that an engineer will understand a lot of things around the manufacturing, and they will keep these things in mind right from the start. While if you work with a designer, maybe they will create some really, really nice sketches, really nice designs, but all of that really does not mean that much if you are then not able to actually manufacture those designs. And from my experience with working with designers who do not have the engineering knowledge, most often what they come up with is frankly useless. So yeah, work with engineers. The next tip that I would like to give is to create prototypes often and early in the development process, because oftentimes prototyping is seen as a huge cost in development. However, I would like to argue that a prototype is actually a way to save cost further down, because by investing into a prototype early on, you can actually find critical issues which will be much more expensive to address later on. And these prototypes do not necessarily need to be very complicated. For example, I was creating a product the other months here where I created a cardboard prototype, and it really looked very cheap because it was very cheap. But that prototype allowed me to find a very critical issue and probably save several thousands down the line. So do not hesitate to invest a little bit in a prototype early on. And then also related to prototyping, I would like to advise that if you are creating an electronics product, that you use either Arduino or Raspberry, which are two type of pre-assembled PCBs, to test out your functionality. Because in consumer electronics, the electronics part is extremely expensive compared to the rest of the project. So by testing out your functionality and validating your product with a pre-assembled solution, you really bring down the overall cost of the project. And then finally, something that I want to mention that is applicable to all types of products is to use as many off-the-shelf components, OTS components, as you can. So whenever possible, don't reinvent the wheel, just buy things that are pre-assembled. So that way you can create a product with a unique exterior look while using modules that are pre-validated and pre-made on the inside of your product. And that will really help to bring down both the cost of the project and also minimize quality assurance issues where something catches on fire, God forbid, or something breaks and you need to do a recall, because a pre-made module will already be in many products and will have been tested with time. So that is another reason for why you should use off-the-shelf components. And now to continue, we can talk a little bit about sourcing and the supply chain. And the first tip that I would like to say is to not do this yourself, because sourcing, it's a very relationship heavy job, which will be difficult for you to do if you're not living in a low cost manufacturing country such as China. And my tip would be to not just not do this yourself, but to work with a team of people instead of hiring individual freelancers for this role. And the reason for why I think sourcing should be done by a team of people instead of a single freelancer is that it's really an octopus type of job where you're doing many different things simultaneously. So having a team of people helps with that process. And now moving on to the topic of the supply chain and mentioning a couple of tips. First off, I would advise to distribute the work between several different factories if your product lends itself to that. And this is for the purpose of IP protection. Because if a single factory is doing all of your different parts, then they will have a much easier time to steal that idea, to start selling it to other competitors, than if you are creating your parts in several different factories and then assembling it in one factory. And there are legal ways to protect your IP as well, such as NNN agreements in China. However, in the end, unless you're a huge corporation, it is very difficult to enforce these agreements. And because of that, I think the most straightforward way to protect your intellectual property is to split up the work between factories. And then you might ask, if I'm splitting up the work between several different factories, how do I actually assemble the product? And the way that I usually advise to do this is to find the factory that is the most accommodating one and ask them to do it as a service. So for example, let's say that I have a product which has metal parts and then textile parts which need to combine into a single product. Well, then I can ask both the metal and the textile factory whether they offer assembly services, and the one that is most willing and accommodating, to that company I will send all of the parts so that they can assemble the complete product and then ship it off to the warehouse. Now, to finish off this webinar, let's talk about the perhaps most important topic out of all of them, and that is what are the common mistakes that people make when taking their ideas to market. And by discussing these mistakes, you can avoid them and save yourself a bunch of time, a lot of heartache, and a lot of money in the process. So let's go. First off, the most common mistake that I see people making is ignoring manufacturing or putting manufacturing as a second priority. And what I mean with this is that perhaps your mechanical engineer is giving some feedback where he says that the product could be manufactured more simply in a certain way or using a certain material, but you push past that advice and really insist on doing it as in your original vision. And I really get this. Like, this can be done with the best of intentions, right? You might want to make the product more user-friendly, you might want to keep a certain look of the product, but the reality is that when you go away from the KISS principle, then you will just encounter so many issues down the line with manufacturing that most often it is not a good idea to push past advice that engineers give you. And at this point, perhaps you're thinking of Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or somebody who really pushed their engineers to do the impossible. And you might say to yourself that if those people had not pushed their engineers, we would not have the Mac and we would not have these amazing rockets that can land again. But remember two things here. First off, Steve Jobs and Elon Musk are complete outliers, right? And second, they have a lot of money behind them. So if they wanted to iterate on some idea for many, many weeks, just spending huge amounts of money on it, they can do that. However, if you're running a lean business, most likely you don't have the capital to simply spend years and years on R&D before getting something to market. You need to do it in a reasonably quick and affordable way, and that means working with manufacturing instead of working against it. Another problem that I often see is that people take on too complicated products for their available budget. Because in my opinion, it's better to have a budget that allows you to iterate many times on a simple product instead of using all of your budget on a single iteration and hope that it will go right the first time. So you want to have significant margin in your budget for errors and for iterations. And then finally, something that I see many businesses doing is to focus so much so on secrecy and not talking about the idea, that the idea validation of the product actually suffers. And this should not be interpreted as if secrecy does not matter. It really does. You should protect your idea. You should sign NDAs. You should get a patent if you believe that the idea is worth patenting. But you should not be that obsessive that you cannot get quotes from manufacturers, that you cannot get feedback from customers, because at that point, what you are most likely to create, it is a very, very secret product that no one will ever know about, that also no one will ever buy because you never validated the idea and you never iterated to make it better. So get the NDA, get the patent, but also remember to not let those things hinder you from gathering feedback. So to reiterate, the most common things that I see tripping people up, it is ignoring manufacturing, not keeping things simple, developing products that are too complicated and being a little bit too ambitious with the scope, and then finally, letting the fear of somebody stealing the idea prevent the product idea from being validated and iterated upon. And with that, we have reached the end of the webinar, and it was actually a lot of fun for me to do it, and I hope that you found it useful. I hope that you will take some tips and tricks away from this. So thank you so much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck with your e-commerce business and your product development projects. Bye.